Thanks. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Ann Hesse, and I lead the Democrats Abroad Global Women's Caucus. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our guest speaker, to our panelists, to our Democrats Abroad members, and to all of you who have taken the time to join this call from around the world. We welcome you to today's discussion, Leading with Purpose, Tackling Structural Barriers to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. As leaders working in an organization that is constantly striving to be more diverse and more equitable, we're especially excited to have Professor Cantor as our guest today to talk about how we might all do better. I'm joined today by Democrats Abroad International Chair Candice Kersten, Pat White and Carol Moore, who lead our GWC Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative, and a panel of members and leaders from a wide variety of DA caucuses and committees. And to all of you who are listening in, please remember that we'll be gathering questions for our speaker from our Zoom Q&A box and on Facebook, where we're streaming live now. So you're welcome to type in your questions as we go along. I'll hand off to Candice now, who will lead our discussion. Candice?
Thank you, Anne, for the very warm introduction, and good morning, Professor Cantor, and good morning and afternoon to everyone tuning in, both in the Zoom and on Facebook. We're thrilled to have you here. As Anne mentioned, my name is Candice Kersten, and I serve as the International Chair of Democrats Abroad. And before we get started, I just want to put this out there at the front for those of you who might not be as familiar with us. Democrats Abroad is the largest organization of US citizens living outside of the United States, and we're also an official arm of the Democratic Party. At the end of the day, it's our mission to provide Americans abroad with a voice in our government and to elect Democratic candidates by mobilizing the overseas vote. For those of you who are listening in and happen to vote in New Jersey or Virginia, don't forget to request your ballot now at votefromabroad.org for the November 2nd elections happening in your states. But when we talk about mobilizing the overseas vote, this also means looking closely at how we organize and how we engage with our communities, both at home and abroad. It's about asking questions as to how we can get more and more people from all walks of life engaged in the political process, and how we can make sure that their voices are heard at all levels of our government. It's through this lens that we are especially thrilled to have Professor Cantor joining us today to speak about tackling structural barriers to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'd now like to pass the mic to Pat White of Democrats Abroad France and Carol Moore of Democrats Abroad United Kingdom, both of whom are active on the Global Women's Caucus Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative, which was launched to help focus our attention on the urgent need to address systemic inequities that shut women out economically and keep them out of positions of leadership. Together, Pat and Carol bring years of experience in philanthropy, finance, social work, and social policy. So now we'll hear from Pat, who will give us some background and introduce the professor.
Thank you, Candice. Hello, everyone. You're in for a treat with today's speaker, Professor Rosabeth Moss Kanter, a woman whose name is synonymous with innovation and leadership for change in corporate culture and management. Rosabeth Moss Kanter is a distinguished Harvard Business School professor whose theories about change in the workforce have permeated much of the thinking about organizational change since her first book was published. She holds the Ernest L. Arbukle Professorship at Harvard Business School, specializing in strategy, innovation, and leadership for change. At Harvard, she co-founded a university-wide advanced leadership institute, guiding its planning from 2005 and serving as its director through 2018. As it became an international higher education model for preparing top leaders to apply their skills to national and global challenges. Her expertise now guides leaders worldwide through teaching, writing, and direct consultation to major corporations, governments, and startup ventures. Professor Cantor has authored or co-authored over 20 books, beginning with her groundbreaking book, Men and Women of the Corporation, which remains a classic analysis of power distribution within organizations. Two of her latest books that are recommended reads include Think Outside the Building, How Advanced Leaders Can Change the World One Smart Innovation at a Time, and Move, Putting America's Infrastructure Back in the Lead, which is a sweeping look across industries and technologies shaping the future of mobility and the leadership required for transformation. Professor Cantor is the former editor of the Harvard Business Review and has been named one of the 50 most powerful women in the world and one of the most 50 influential business thinkers in the world. How's that for honors? Professor Cantor has served on many business and nonprofit boards and commissions. She speaks widely and has shared the platform with presidents, prime ministers, and CEOs at major events, such as the World Economic Forum, and national conferences in over 20 countries. Before joining the Harvard Business School faculty, she held tenured professorship at Yale and Brandeis Universities and was a fellow at Harvard Law School. Professor Cantor is a leader with purpose, staying focused and committed to an important body of work that is filled with obstacles to women's advancement. Still making history today, Professor Cantor will now share her thoughts about the structural barriers that continue to limit women's leadership and what it will take to make the workplace a more inclusive and equitable place for all women. The Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative of the Global Women's Caucus is proud to present this great educator, thinker, leader, and woman, our speaker today. Join me in welcoming Professor Cantor.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you, and thank you for being here. I'm very humbled because I know you are all incredibly knowledgeable. And I mean, to have my friend Connie Board and her partner Sheila, who are the world's leading experts on Simone de Beauvoir, is humbling, because Simone de Beauvoir taught us about the experience of the other, which is a really important starting point for the work I've done. And also for being here right after President Biden addressed the UN General Assembly. And it was a very inspiring talk. He talked about this as a moment of intermingles great pain and extraordinary possibility. He also called it a decisive decade, and he made a point about talking about universal rights for all people, about the rights of women and girls, and about the countries that will flourish will be the ones that unleash the potential of their people rather than stifle it. So those are great sentiments with which I begin. Now, I'm a very positive person, so I want to end up with positive actions and things we can do. But unfortunately, because of this decisive moment in our history, I have to start out with a thing that I never really liked, going to dinner parties and have them accompanied by fine wines. And yes, that isn't a typo. I mean wines as in the complaining cry and not the Chardonnay. Because there are so many things that people are concerned about. And in fact, it's not only a decisive moment, I think it's a Handmaid's Tale moment, in which a very quick flip could easily take away rights that people have enjoyed. And it's interesting that Margaret Atwood's book was published in 1985, in the middle of a decade that showed great change, mistrust of government, and a weakening of the feminist movements that had been very active in the 60s and 70s. So what happened in the 80s didn't necessarily advance the kind of inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion that we want to have now. And we know that flipping is happening very quickly. I mean, everyone knows about Afghanistan, locking women out of their jobs and out of their schools. Well, in Handmaid's Tale, the flip to a theocratic women suppressing society occurred almost instantly via technology, cutting off credit cards so that women had no credit, couldn't shop, were totally dependent on men. This kind of instant flipping, the Texas ban on abortions, and that anyone can sue, suppressing voter rights, happening like quickly, whereas the progress toward rights tends to occur slowly. The flip on the other side can occur quickly. COVID, which came upon us fairly quickly, has uncovered huge racial disparities everywhere, partly because of the correlation between race, particularly being Black and brown, and income inequality. But it also has had suppressing gender effects. As you know, more women than men are leaving the workforce. And that's not only because of the child care deficit, and that's something that I've written about now for well over 45 years, arguing that the US needed a child care system. So I was delighted. I was on the Biden Infrastructure Policy Committee, so I knew it was coming to have that be part of infrastructure, a child care infrastructure to help people with work and with family at the same time. But also women leaving the workforce is because of unfulfilling jobs and occupational segregation. That means that there is still a pay gap. It's now in the US about 80 cents on the dollar, not 72 cents on the dollar. I suppose that's progress. I used to do a little exercise in some talks where I asked people to, a little sentence completion test, complete the sentence, if women ran the world, ... And I got lots of different answers, but one of my answers was if women ran the world, running the world would pay 80 cents on the dollar. So we still have a lot of inequities, sexual harassment, more revelations of it, whether there's more instances, it doesn't matter because painful revelations are surfacing. There is more fragmentation among populations of women, not the same supposed solidarity. It probably wasn't real solidarity of sisterhood is powerful because we have recognized all the differences that come about because of race, ethnicity, social class, and that the situations are totally different depending on location, on color, and on income and the needs of women. So we can't say there's one monolithic group of women and this is what they need. So women's agenda gets a little harder to create unless we talk about economic empowerment, as you are doing. And there is also, we're facing a moment of mistrust in government, real mistrust in government, and the elites, the people at the upper end of the income distribution can escape from dysfunctional government by creating private solutions, whether it's private planes or private childcare, multiple homes, concierge docs, nanny services. So they don't necessarily need the public system. They found ways to work around it. And when I think about America, I thought this is not the America that I thought I was growing up into, in which the public system was there to work for everybody, public transportation, and the infrastructure we had all come to count on. So everybody else other than the elites need public access. And that's an institutional and a significant change problem. So what that leaves is a lot of people, a lot of women who are juggling. And that's the title I'm going to hold up here, an image. I have to hold it up so you can really see it. An image of a painting by an artist friend of mine in a show that just opened. And this painting is called Juggling. It shows a woman, partly her body's exposed, she's drowning, she's juggling, and she has her voice suppressed. And that's unfortunately how many women feel. She's ambiguous in terms of, slightly ambiguous in terms of race. And that image really struck me in a powerful way. But now I want to get to the good news. We know that's the backdrop, but we have to really feel the severity of those issues. So the good news is you. The good news is leaders who are rising to the challenge. And I call that, this is my bumper sticker that's also could be a hashtag, the optimism, with my virtual background, I always have to figure out where to hold it. The optimism of activism. That is, if all of these problems of the world are depressing, and so the tendency is to whine, complain, but feel depressed and not do anything about it, it's you, the activists, who are going to bring about the optimism that comes from feeling you can do something, anything, however small, because those things add up and make a difference. And we have so many positive changes in the world that we can applaud. I mean, we have women's leadership in so many countries. I'm a huge fan, as I assume many of you are, of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who is simply leading her country with confidence and a sense of purpose. And New Zealand has always had many women leaders. In part, it was explained to me that's because of the smaller population. It was also explained to me that women go into public service, but they still don't necessarily hold, even in New Zealand, top positions in the businesses that are based there. But we can feel very optimistic because of these clear signs of what women can do when they hold major public office. And in Boston, my home city, I'm speaking to you from Cambridge across the river, so I don't vote in Boston, but we have a mayor's race in which all the final 5 candidates were people of color, and the 2 who are now going to vie to be mayor of Boston are both women of color. What a change. In Boston, which had the busing crisis because of a white Irish dominated city. We have women on board mandates in California, now in NASDAQ and a major stock exchange, because when women are in boards, as we know from some Scandinavian countries, it isn't so much that all women's interests are the same and they talk about things exactly the same way. That doesn't happen. But what does happen is it gives other women the aspiration because they look and see that they're women in power making decisions. And of course, I do applaud the Biden infrastructure proposal because infrastructure to get people to work, infrastructure should be and is a women's issue. And it's not just whether there's a social safety net and an infrastructure for childcare, but transportation is a huge issue, public transportation. If people are going to work and jobs have to be more fulfilling, pay better wages, but also we need the infrastructure to support women getting to work. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how to think about actions from leading, going back to Men and Women of the Corporation, which, by the way, was an early book. It wasn't my first book, but from Men and Women of the Corporation all the way to today, and Think Outside the Building, some ways to think about the dimensions of change that we need to make in order to advance women and economic empowerment. And if you advance it for women, you're going to be finding that these same structural mechanisms will advance economic empowerment for all people. And that's where women's rights are human rights and vice versa. So the first, 3 dimensions in Men and Women of the Corporation: opportunity, power, and numbers. I later gave a TED talk where they translated a little bit to what I called 3 I's: inclusion, influence, and impact. And so I want to start with opportunity and inclusion. So opportunity structures obviously make a big difference in whether women or anybody get in the door in the first place. Opportunity and inclusion are about getting in the door, getting the job, getting the position. And it's not necessarily, it should be a choice whether people want to be in the workforce or not. Yet, I have a little bias leaning toward let's give them the chance, because opportunity not only provides economic independence, because the chances that women are going to find themselves needing the resources at some point in life and needing it from their own activities and actions, but it's also that opportunity as a phenomenon, having opportunity builds confidence. And it's that confidence that makes it possible for women to lead. So Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, there was an opportunity pathway for a woman to become prime minister because there had been others, and women were valued as important assets for public service. And when you know that there's an opportunity pathway, then aspirations go up. I could be anything, I could do anything. Where opportunity is limited and people feel stuck, no point in aspiring, because that's not going to happen anyway. And so what it takes to get inclusion is, first of all, that there are opportunity pathways, which mean that hiring has to be more equitable, and new technology may be making it less equitable. There have been many studies that show that algorithms systematically discriminate against people by race and gender, sometimes because of non-traditional backgrounds and pathways, sometimes because of their name and the assumptions that come with their name, the stereotypes that come about whether women can actually do it, whether women are worth investing in, that come from not seeing other women in those positions. So Russ, I have my fabulous assistant, Russ, is going to share a screen and show us a short video of a couple of women talking who are entrepreneurs with fantastic enterprises, talking about the barriers they faced in getting venture capital. Russ, video? Hi, Russ? Okay.
Yep, I'm pulling it up now.
Yes, thank you.
Founder of a startup, I faced countless barriers. I used to have my team slide at the end of my pitch deck, and I had an investor tell me that since I was a woman working on an edtech startup, he spent the whole pitch assuming I couldn't run a business. And then he saw my HBS logo on the team slide towards the end. Needless to say, that slide became slide number 3 moving forward. There's also a lot of bias from Silicon Valley about our startup being based in Miami in our early years. Many investors assumed we just weren't good enough to get into a male-dominated accelerator in the Bay Area, or had some family obligations that precluded us from moving across the country. But honestly, I just didn't want to build my company in Broville and spend 75% of the money I raised on rent and inflated employee salaries.
I would see is a historical service economy, and the entrepreneur community as it relates to tech was embryonic as I was starting ecotech. So net along green tech, net along robotics, advanced manufacturing frameworks, that wasn't a part of the existing ecosystem until I came around. That was a huge barrier to sort of ideate what green tech, clean tech, and sustainability can look like, both for my startup, but also for a larger community. In addition to that, being a woman required more convincing that I think I would have had if I had other skin and a different gender. Opened up the first facility. I put in $250,000 of my own money, opened up a prototype space, and within about 6 months, we had 16 companies in the facility. And I went to purchased the headquarters, the location that's now my headquarters. So the building was on sale for 1.5 million. I put down the 10% to purchase that facility, and I learned an extremely difficult lesson. Going into spaces and people assuming I'm a stripper because they're not used to seeing Black women in any capacity of wealth, having not gotten it from their body rather than their mind or their purpose.
Look,
Okay, thank you. Okay, there we are. I mean, just to remind us that inclusion is a matter of how it's viewed, who gets the resources, who gets the job, and it's for entrepreneurs who are very accomplished and distinguished people, but they can't get in the door either. And so developing pathways, it's not education per se. I believe in education for women and girls, but women have more education than men. That's been true for decades. In fact, in my doctoral exams, too many years ago to even mention the year, one of the questions on the exam, and I thought it was a very enlightened question for the time, but one of the questions on the exam was, why is it that girls outperform boys in school, and yet men have the leadership positions in society? So we need to move beyond education per se, we can't let it go, to opportunity pathways that will connect women in venture capital circles, Black people in venture capital circles, that will include people for their accomplishments in hiring algorithms and not their credentials. One of my colleagues is working on how to make algorithms much more equitable and not talking only about your degrees and which schools you went to. So opportunity is a critical area to work on change. The second is power. Power comes from your network, your sponsors. It's how you get at the table. If inclusion gets you in the door, then power, or gets you influence, gets you at the table. So to get at the table, to be making decisions, first of all, you had to be in the door, but then you need two other things. You need networks and you need time. And there's a certain amount of evidence that the networks women form, which are very strong, and in fact, lots of solidarity, yet they're often not task-oriented. Whereas the men's networks, these are broad findings and very stereotypical, but tend to be much more task-oriented and much broader. Women's circles tended to be small, more intimate, and potentially much more fulfilling, we could say, but the men were broadening their reach. And in fact, power comes, influence comes from knowing people well beyond the current boundaries of the work one's doing or the neighborhood one is living in. And part of what confines underrepresented people, people of color, leaves them out is in part, they can't get beyond the boundaries of their neighborhood easily, don't know people in all those other influential circles. So networks become very important, but networks and the things you do beyond the job also require time. And I did a blog a few years ago where I said the way you get power and influence is not by doing your job well, it's by doing the extras beyond the job. That meant making introductions, serving on a community board, showing up at meetings and breakfasts. And I thought to myself, okay, there we go. That by itself is going to help exclude people that have responsibilities at home. And so one of the things we've learned is that the household division of labor has barely budged in decades and decades. And labor-saving devices starting in the 50s that made housework so much easier still didn't change the household division of labor. So when I spoke recently, not that recently now, on a panel at Barnard, where the topic was what men can do for women's leadership, when it was my turn, I said, here's what men can do for women's leadership: the laundry. Okay, cute. widely quoted. Sheryl Sandberg put it in her book, but it's absolutely true. If we don't move the household division of labor, and structurally how to do that, we have to give more opportunities to men to be stay-at-home dads, flexible work. Now we know in the pandemic that's something everybody wants. And so we must move that household division of labor, and a child care infrastructure would be a blessing in doing that, because it could also be picking up the kids, can also be a time when people network, and therefore that would appeal to those people who are ambitious and want broader networks. So there's much we need to do about power. And thirdly, numbers. Having a critical mass, because tipping points in how many people are of what kind are in any given group and in any given power circle. That was my third variable in Men and Women of the Corporation, led to my work on tokenism. But we need those critical masses and tipping points to avoid stereotyping, blame the victim, and the sheer overload on people who are different. Because it's impossible to get to my third I of impact, which is a chance to make a difference beyond your job, beyond your organization. That's what I call outside the building, thinking outside the building. That's where you have real impact by helping institutions change. But it's hard to do that if there's only one like you. And as we saw, Maxine Tuckman, the Latina, who is building a great tech company with huge potential to scale, and yet can't attract Silicon Valley venture capital. And because she's so different, she's one of the few successful Latinx entrepreneurs in the United States, getting lots of awards, but awards don't translate to impact. And Pandway Gibson, Ecotech Visions, she has a PhD, she has a great idea for green incubators in Black neighborhoods, and yet she's stereotyped as a stripper, because how else? An adult dancer, I think we say more politely in my case, because how else would a woman achieve resources on her own, especially at a time when the wealth gap between white and Black is enormous, enormous. I mean, very little actual accumulated wealth in the hands of the majority of African Americans. So to have impact, you need critical mass. You can't be alone, because also when you get alone, maybe I have time to show one more little clip. It's a short clip, Russ, from my video, A Tale of O, which is about tokenism, about being the one letter O in a group consisting of all X's, and how the dominant group treats that person who's different, back to Simone de Beauvoir, and what it means to be the only of your kind. Here's just one thing it means. So Russ, can we have the Tale of O clip?
The O's get evaluated for two different things. First, whether they can demonstrate the same expertise as the X's, and second, how well they match the X's idea of a good O. Being the only or representative O also gives the O an extra job to do, serving as spokes-O, talking for all O's. The O might be sent off to public events as a show O. For example, in meetings.
What do you O's think about this?
Or,
we'd like you to join the committee to give us the O's point of view.
Or,
could you speak at our next program? We're devoting it entirely to the problems of O's.
eventually, if the O does well, it will be expected to meet with every board or task force or planning group because they all need to include an O. And this seems to be the only qualified O around. For the O, this often results in overload.
I guess those O's just can't take the heat.
Okay, thank you. Back to me, thank you. And so that overload that comes from spending your whole time, because you're rare, fighting battles, representing your group, et cetera. So numbers really matter, critical mass. That's why I love the board quotas. I wish we had more quotas, or we can call them goals, expectations, but it really makes a difference. And we're seeing it right now in Congress. I'm very proud of the fact that I got to know at least 5 women elected in 2018 to Congress who not only have been strong voices on their own, but they have banded together. You don't get solidarity and form networks unless there are more of you, because then you are not singled out as the token, and you have critical mass, you have your own network, which brings power and helps you include other people. So that includes, they even founded a PAC together, Congress Representative Mikey Sherrill, Chrissy Houlihan, Abigail Spanberger, Elaine Luria, and Alyssa Slotkin. They all have been playing major roles in Congress. They support one another, rather than only competing for funds or voters. They're part of a movement, and we need more people, more people in positions of influence. We need the numbers to go up, as well as opening opportunity pathways, broadening networks, and providing the support so that people can put in the time, not doing a second shift, but the community shift, the network shift. And then we need to make sure that we keep increasing the numbers, because numbers really matter. And if we do those things, and there are many more things that we should be doing also, then we are justified in having the optimism of activism. Then we can say we are making a difference on all those fronts, because these variables connect to one another. More opportunity, more pathways, structural pathways that get people out of places where they're stuck into pathways toward jobs or investments or resources. That has a psychological effect. It builds aspirations, it builds confidence. Having networks that are broader. And that means men too. That means women and men together, having lots of contacts well beyond those that are close. It's the strength of weak ties, not strong ties. It's the people you only know at a distance. And we have to make sure women are out there and they have the connections and the networks so that they too will end up having influence in their own circles and a seat at the table. And that will help the numbers go up. And when the numbers go up, women can have real impact. I have lots of examples of the impact that's what my advanced leadership initiative at Harvard was doing, building possibilities for later stage leaders to take on big global challenges, whether climate, racial and gender disparities, or health access. Well, men and women alike, you can't have impact if you're spending all your time being overloaded by dealing with the problems of tokenism. And so, like the 5 congresswomen I admire so much, if we help build up the numbers and argue for those goals or quotas in every realm, good old California, with the requirement of women on boards, is certainly taking an important step. So here's to the optimism of activism, and thank you. I'm looking forward to your questions, your comments, our dialogue.
Wow, that was exciting. Oh my goodness. I love the oh my goodness. Who on this call had an O? Yeah, we all know what that's like. That's amazing. I also just picked up the term Broville. I had not known that before.
Yes, well, that's it's now being used to talk about Silicon Valley or any system in which men dominate. I mean, you know, like some of my best friends are men. I'm not, this is not anti-man, but there are crony circles. And I've been arguing, I just wrote an op-ed with a couple of my women leadership friends on crony capitalism. One of the problems with capitalism isn't capitalism, it's crony capitalism, when people only trade favors or give opportunities to people exactly like them. So Broville is a way of thinking of people who are only letting into their circle people exactly like them. They're sort of a band of cronies, of friends who make sure that power and opportunity stays in their circle. And I'm happy for them to have power and opportunity, but I don't want them to be excluding others. All right, thank you.
Edith?
Thank you so much, Professor Cantor. I have to say, hearing that through the lens of the young female perspective is just incredibly powerful, and appreciate you sharing your observations and research from all these years and enlightening us with that. So I already see some hands up and a question coming from Lee Donald Moore, our Global Black Caucus chair in Switzerland, has a question for you.
Yes, hello everybody, and hello Dr. Cantor. Thank you very much for your outstanding presentation, filled with facts, figures, and above all, a lot of charm. I truly resonate with the sentence that you said, think outside of the building, because I'm a true believer that unity can only be achieved by a diverse leadership utilizing the power of intersectionality. And the question which I'm leading to now is based on a survey by the Global Entrepreneur Monitor that depicts that Black women are more likely to start a business than white men. But despite starting businesses at a high rate of an astounding 17% of Black women, only 3% are running mature businesses. In contrast, white women are more than twice as likely to be mature business owners, with only 7% as well. But despite starting at lower rates of just 10% and 15% of white men, this disparity between high startup and low established business activity among Black women suggests potential issues with sustaining a business. How can adopting diversity, equity, and inclusion measures effectively uproot and dismantle inequality and, above all, structural racism? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. A very important question. One of the reasons that I have video on those women, and it's part of an HBS case. I have a couple of women. I'm doing one on a Black woman in Boston whose activities are all helping build a more inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystem. And we need to be supporting that. That is organizing across color lines to get a venture capital fund together dedicated to women's businesses. By the way, of venture capital, important venture capital, about 95% of it goes to white males in America, according to one study. So that's very true. And one of the reasons Black women may start businesses at a higher rate is because they're starting small neighborhood businesses, whether they're hair salons, nail salons, beauty businesses, retail, childcare, because they have to support their families and they may not be able to get jobs. So just because people start a business, not all startups are created equal. And small business, the backbone of America, et cetera, not necessarily. Small businesses are often very marginal, have trouble flourishing, as you said, trouble getting to grow at all. So we should be thinking about scale ups. We should be thinking, and some of these have national policy and resource allocation implications. We should be thinking about how to find businesses with growth potential is one thing. Secondly, we should be thinking about how to create more collaboratives and cooperatives. America, as compared to some of the countries some of you are sitting in right now, tends to believe more in individualism than collaboration, and yet collaboration also builds businesses, because many of the big businesses I study are only growing now because they create lots of alliances and partnerships. Why are we not creating those alliances at the neighborhood level and helping people flourish, rather than having every nonprofit, for example, at the neighborhood level, compete with every other nonprofit for funds, and want to remain independent because it's their chance to be a CEO. How do we get them together, give more people a chance to see more power? Like Connie Board and I spend time on a little island in Massachusetts in the summer that has 6 very small towns on one island. There are 6 police forces, 6 school systems, 6 select boards. We've taken men off the name of that, and it's now select boards. And you can't get them to cooperate because those 6 police forces in little tiny jurisdictions. Somebody will have to be the one policeman. So we have to find ways to create more collaboration, whether it's rotation or whatever, in all of our institutions. And your question is so good. It's such, I could say more about it. I'm writing cases on some of this, how you build a more inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystem. The capital certainly matters. The government can help. One way government can help, we did this in Massachusetts at one point, is by loan guarantees. And you would think that the COVID relief money would have helped in all of that, and it has helped, but I think it's probably disproportionately helped people like the men who don't get easily discouraged because of the confidence factor. When you see opportunity, I believe women are strong and can be as confident as anybody, but you have to see that there's real opportunity. And then thank you for mentioning my title, Think Outside the Building. That's the book. Think Outside the Building means thinking more broadly. All right, let me stop because I would love to hear more, but thank you for that good question or comment.
All right, thank you for that answer. We have another question from Pat White, the lead of the Global Women's Caucus Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative.
Professor, thank you so much for your presentation. We know that to reach your suggestion of scale or numbers, I was fascinated by the 3 concepts of inclusion, influence, and impact. I'd like to offer 3 parallel concepts, which is authority, intelligence, and idea sharing. And we know that those elements are critical in terms of one's ability to make advancements in the workplace. Yet they are treated differently for women, in particularly women of color. So my question to you is, how does one address and overcome these basic realities that if one's authority, one's intellect, and one's ideas are not valued? How do we overcome that as barriers to advancements?
So great observation, great question. You know, there's a common social science finding, which I'm very skeptical about, I must say. And I wrote Men and Women with the Corporation years ago because of skepticism about findings that blamed the victim, saying it's women's fault, or that it's characteristics of women as opposed to structures and pathways. So the finding is that women can't be viewed as both competent and attractive. Oh, give me a break. If you have the power, if you have the resources, you look very attractive. People want to be with you. So what happens is that women, you know, who try to, are told that they're too pushy trying to get into a conversation or too aggressive. A lot of that is being the being the only, where you're not automatically included. But if you speak up, then you can get listened to if, and here's the if, and it is an extra burden for women, but I think increasingly for anybody who wants to lead. You have to be operating on behalf of other people. Not necessarily totally altruistically, giving up your own interests. There's another finding that women do better in negotiations. That is, the women themselves are more effective as negotiators when they're negotiating on behalf of somebody else rather than themselves. And some of that's the discomfort about asking for yourself. But using that principle, though, impact is what you do that makes the world a better place for a lot of people. And so the more you're acting on behalf of the many, then your authority, your ideas, they get listened to. Because if that brings you followers, people pay attention because you have followers. And so, yes, the power of ideas is not enough unless you're acting on them. But once you have demonstrated, like our initiative at Harvard, it's a miracle, by the way, that we got a 400-year-old institution to support our new stage of higher education. But once I had gotten enough people on board, and the vision was inspiring enough, and I thought a lot about what everybody would get out of it, everybody, then it took off, and I certainly could lead. So the way authority comes in part because these days authority has to be earned. Sometimes you have the authority to order people around, but increasingly they'll push back. And this, for Candace, the young person in the workforce, I mean, there's a lot of employee activism in the United States, pushing back against hiring practices they don't like at Apple, pushing back against customer practices they don't like the Wayfair employees protesting, selling mattresses to those cages in which kids were kept on the border in the last administration. Employee protest matters a lot. So there's a lot of ways to get voice and a lot of ways to act on voice, but I think one has to be acting on a cause bigger than yourself. And if it's self-interested, it's much harder for a person who's different to get listened to. But if it's on behalf of various groups, that's why I'm so proud of the women of color that might be mayors of Boston. I mean, Michelle Wu has been working on transportation problems for a long time. And those are problems that benefit everybody. And yet she's also a women's activist.
Thank you.
Wow. We have a lot of questions coming up on social media in our chat box. So I'd like to interject really quickly, a very short but potent question for you. How do you feel about universal basic income as a tool for empowering women?
So it's interesting because it's a tool for empowering lots of people. So, you know, there's a lot of things to think about there that are really very important. Anybody that's concerned about reparations, about, you know, what we do about people who had property taken away has to be thinking about that. And universal basic income that gives every kid a start in life, you know, like that, baby bonds, really interesting thing. I know various mayors around the country. The mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota, is not only working with 10 mayors on reparations strategy, but also he does have baby bonds started in St. Paul. You know, that doesn't solve every problem, but it certainly helps ease the strain for people, as we've seen during the pandemic. The income supports that people got have made a difference in their ability to survive and thrive. So if that's tied to opening opportunity pathways, so because it has to be wider. These are big, big dilemmas. Take charter schools, for example, which once was a Democratic issue, then it became, because it was choice and they get more resources for poor communities, then it became a Republican issue. You know, get rid of the school boards and government restrictions. But in fact, there are some outstanding schools that are helping kids of color achieve, but they're unconnected to anything else. And so once they achieve in that school, which are very segregated, they can't go on to do other things. So I like the new kind of, not, you know, I'm moving beyond universal basic income right here, but I like some new creative models. There's a 6-year high school model that involves getting your 4 years of high school and a 2-year community college degree at the same time. And many kids in the first pilot in New York City did it in 4 years, both degrees, but it was in partnership with employers. And so everybody got internships and a job offer if they graduated, and a job offer. And so there was the poster boy for that, Radcliffe Sadler in Brooklyn, graduated in 4 years and got, and this was several years ago, a $50,000 tech job at IBM. And so he's now in that, so it's a new opportunity pathway toward higher income through education. So it's though, you know, I didn't have time in this talk to go through absolutely every solution. And because it's tech, they still have more men than women. So we've got to get those girls saying, including me, saying tech is for you. I mean, if I didn't have Russ, who you saw before, if I didn't have Russ helping me fight the technology, or let's say master the technology, because we have to make sure it's learned by every kid in school. And so girls feel just as confident. Coding was once a female skill. If you saw Hidden Figures or any of the other bestsellers about the Black women who coded, coding was a women's skill because it looked clerical. And then it looked like the route to tech fame and fortune, it became male. We could grab those things back. And universal basic income is certainly a tool to be explored.
Thank you for that. Do you have time for just a few more questions?
I have time. It's the middle of the day for me. I don't know about all of you.
All right, excellent. I know we have some hands up, and I see one from our DNC member, one of our 8 DNC members for Democrats Abroad, Martha McDevitt-Pugh of the Netherlands.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Professor Cantor, hi. So my question is about the moment that we're in. You know, you've been a pioneer. When you started your work on diversity, you might have even been a lone voice in the business world. Whereas today, having a D&I statement and a program is an imperative for many organizations, which is a great start. But having said that, acknowledging our own bias requires the willingness to put ourselves in the shoes of those who have life experiences that are different to our own. Those are those O's in your powerful tale of what it's like to be different. And I have to say, as a lesbian woman and the founder of the Democrats Abroad LGBTQ+ caucus, I recognize being that token and carrying that weight in a crony type environment, potentially. I wondered if you could say something about what it takes for organizations to create a space where people can start to see their own role in keeping the status quo in place, and they can discover how they can open up pathways and their networks for underrepresented groups and to increase those numbers.
Great, really great question. And then there's also comment question, and there's also one in the chat I want to address really briefly. But that's really important. How can they do it? One way is service. When people serve together, people who are different, and you're dependent on one another, like Mikey Sherrill and many of the others who are now in Congress are part of the movement, New Politics, getting people who have served in either the military or national service or certain other forms of public service to run for office. And as many of them say, if you're in that, Mikey Sherrill was a helicopter pilot. If you're in that helicopter together, you don't ask, what party are you from? What's your race? Are you socially acceptable? You just pull together and make it work. And, you know, in the foxhole, you protect one another. And, you know, I don't think the military is perfect. We know there's lots of issues in the military. There are going to be issues everywhere. We just have to work where we can. But I do believe that more universal, whether we would mandate universal or not, but that more national service would make a huge difference. It would take people out of, young people, out of the community they grew up in, into some other community to serve, and the people they serve with are going to be different. And in the course of working together, you can talk about your differences more readily. I am not a huge believer, because they haven't necessarily worked, in diversity training programs that get people to confess that you were bad once and said something inappropriate. Better to hear from somebody you've gotten to know who says, you know, I've hesitated to say something, but, you know, I find that a little offensive. And, and then, you know, if you care because you care about that person. And there is evidence, again, from a colleague of mine at Harvard, Frank Dobbin, that diversity training does not change diversity numbers and that people rebel against it. So I don't think we're going to sit down and have one national conversation. We can have small circles where people get to know each other across divides. The temple I belong to in Boston has a partnership with a Black church, and I happen to be friends with the ministers of the Black church, very active people, and small groups from the temple and the church have been getting together for a year in different, when they could, in different people's homes or in Zoom, get to know each other. So there's a lot of things you could do programmatically, and you could do that inside companies too. But service, we should all be. It should be a huge thing. In fact, it will be a huge thing in the bill because there will be a climate core, and that will involve a big expansion of AmeriCorps. But why I kept arguing during the campaign on all the policy committees, I kept lobbing into every conversation, national service. My other solution, which is, well, I won't say it because it's just kind of funny. And I want to mention what was said in the, yay, city year. I see that from Katie Solon. Yes, I was on the city year board for 25 years advocating for national service. So the question about 17, 18% of women in the Senate and House, et cetera. Think about that number and think about the X's and O's I showed you. It was 1 O in a group of like 7 X's. That's a percentage, about 17, 18%. Gina Davis, the actress who was trying to do equity in her institute, had a finding at one point that what looked normal to people in a movie, in a crowd scene, was no more than 18% women. After that, it started not to look normal. Think about that. That's a threshold we need to cross. We have to make it look natural. And again, hooray for California. We can say New Hampshire too. Hooray for California, because boys in California grow up saying, I could never be a US Senator. That's a woman's job. Well, okay, good. That's it. Any job could be a woman's job or a man's job. That's the goal. And my other goal is the point at which we really can't tell. Like we do a lot now about, we're doing it at HBS too. We have to count the number of Blacks in this, the number of Latinx in that. And, I kind of want everybody to marry each other so we actually can't tell what you are. I said it's a little facetious, tongue in cheek, but intersectionality, yes, everybody's a mix of a lot of things. And so that's not a solution, but frankly, the things we've chipped away at through the years, whether it was interracial marriages, gay marriage, all of those things begin to advance some sense of human rights and that we're human first, and we come in different shapes, we come in different kinds of bodies, but we're human first and we care about making the world a better place.
Absolutely, thank you. And I just wanted to echo along those lines with, really the value of networks, the value of community, and the value of civic engagement. I have to, of course, make a pitch here for Democrats Abroad. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about our organization. I was born and raised in rural white Pennsylvania. And through this organization, we've really come to know so many people from so many different states and different walks of life that I never would have encountered if it wasn't for our organization. And I think I see a lot of heads nodding, and that really is the beauty of Democrats Abroad in a lot of ways, and organizations stateside as well. So along those lines, though, I have one final question here for you, and I'm sure you have quite a bit that you could recommend to us, but I just wanted to know, beyond today's call, beyond getting active, what would you encourage Americans abroad to do at this moment in history?
Talk to everybody possible. Make as many friends and allies and go back to the places that you have friends and family, talk to them, talk about the importance of it, talk about what difference it makes to you personally. I think you already are doing things like the march that Carol was talking about that's going to occur in London. There are a lot of causes, and there are a lot of people with, if we say there's misinformation about vaccines, oh my God, that's horrible. But we know that influence comes person to person. There are a lot of things that one can do programmatically. And so you could have an umbrella in which people post their initiative. And if anybody else wants to join their initiative, and you want a wide array of initiatives, that's what a social movement is. It's going after many things simultaneously, and also the things you can do as individuals to try to influence and educate. So I think being as educated as possible, as I'm sure you all are, and the people who are still on the call, and you know, tell the truth, talk about facts, and because we are at a point where we could tip easily, and I think a lot of people don't see it. And it's really sad that it's taken deaths of unvaccinated people to tip some people over the edge to get vaccinated. We need a sense of common purpose. We seem to have lost that. And I find even in my talks, you know, I have to keep justifying things, like justifying diversity because it's really better for the business. Sure, it is, but fairness and responsibility to society matter a lot too. So, you know, I think you all probably know what you're working on in your countries and who you can influence, and you can also have influence through the people you know in the countries you're now residing in who themselves have influence and can speak up. So, you know, I hope France comes along and doesn't stay bent out of shape because of submarine contracts, you know, but that's not for me to say. But I think that because allies are incredibly important at every level. And the more our country, our leaders have allies, the easier it is to support them in standing up for the things that are right. And I'm not sure I mean, I think about these issues a lot, and there's just so much to say. I know I've talked at you about many, many different dimensions. And that's because, again, the issues are complex. We start where we can, but by joining efforts and by knowing all the things that are going on, it's great that you have the caucus connecting all of you. That's really important. So I wish you great success. I wish you the best. And thank you for the opportunity to talk with you.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Cantor. My goodness, my head is so full. How about everybody else? Full head? Thanks to you so much, and thanks to everybody who's been on the call with us today. We've learned so much, and I should mention that our wonderful guest has written a lot of amazing books, so do check those out. I'd like to also let you know that our GWC has a full program of online events and actions coming up, including a month-long feminist literature festival led by Connie Board, and a conversation with Congresswoman Lois Frankel of Florida, led by Carol Moore, who Lois Frankel co-chairs the House Democratic Women's Caucus. So please follow the link in the chat box and find out more about these and other women's events. We'd love to see you there. Candace?
Thank you, Anne. In closing, I'd really just like, again, to give a huge shout out to all of our great volunteers, both on camera and behind the scenes, and let everyone on the call know that our Democrats Abroad's teams would love to have your help, especially as we gear up for such an important election year in 2022. So please consider stepping up and becoming a volunteer with Democrats Abroad. The link for that will also be in the chat box in just a moment. I'd also like to thank Professor Cantor and Russ for joining today and again sharing these insights that will really stick with us for some time, and again I'm sure will mold how we're approaching organizing both in and outside of Democrats Abroad. And of course, we need your support moving forward. So be that with volunteering or perhaps making a donation to Democrats Abroad. We are a volunteer-run and donation-based organization, and your support really does go a long way. I encourage you to go to democratsabroad.org/donate so that we continue to bring more people into our organization and put on more events like these for Americans all around the world. any donation signs really does help. So I encourage you to go over to democratsabroad.org/donate. For now, we will say goodbye. And again, thank you to everyone who tuned in. We look forward to seeing you at one of those great events that Anne mentioned. And I'm wishing you a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us and hope to see you next time.